Welcome, everybody. I'm really delighted to welcome you all this afternoon for the third of this season's School of Management book series. My name's Steve Brammer. I'm the Dean of the University of Bath School of Management. Our book series is a series of events in which we celebrate and explore recent books written by members of the School of Management community. These events give us an opportunity to hear from leading experts about their books, provide audiences with an opportunity to pose questions and engage directly with the book's authors. It's lovely to see so many of you in this week before Christmas arriving for today's events. Welcome. Today, I'm delighted to welcome a wonderful colleague, Professor Steve Wyatt, to talk about his book, Management and Leadership in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Capabilities to Achieve Superior Performance. I think we all want superior performance, so we're looking forward to that, Steve. As well as being all-round fabulous, multi-talented guy, Professor Steve Wyatt is Professor of Strategy and Leadership in the University of Bath School of Management. He's also Executive Director of the school's in-career and executive development programs. In that role, Steve builds on his experience before joining the School of Management, where Steve was Executive Director of Singapore Management University's Executive Development Business Unit. In that role, Steve supported the development of over 3,500 executives every year. Before that, Steve was a senior management consultant. He was regional managing partner for Monitor Group, now part of Monitor Deloitte, and later for leadership consulting practice of Heidrick and Struggles. He's also an entrepreneur and a business founder, as well as academic, educator, mentor, coach, and he's started up and founded a number of businesses. Building on all that experience, I guess Steve will tell us how all of that body of experience has informed his book. Today, we talk about it won't feature very prominently for you with this, but you can see it on the shelf behind Steve shortly. We talk about management leadership in the fourth industrial revolution, now available on the shelves of every good bookstore and all the right digital providers. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's ask the obvious start of the 10. I gave a bit of a resume of the sorts of things we've been up to. Tell us about the book. What motivated you to write it? What's it about? Who's it for?
So I was classically trained. We're going to go back a long way in order to answer that question. I was classically trained in schools of strategy, and as you mentioned, I used to run the region for a strategy house, and most of the laws and theories of strategy were written in America, in the US, or maybe added to in Europe. So a very westernized view of how strategy should be done. But I was living and working in Asia, and very often the mandate that we were given was to work for a US or European-based company who are paying for us to sort out or come up with some strategic insights for Asia, for what they perceived as their slightly underperforming or rebellious or out of control operations they had there. But the more you get into sort of seeing the reality that these guys are dealing with in these different markets in Asia, which are very low transparency oftentimes, very high rate of change and flux, regulatory demand cycles, who's a competitor or not, and so forth, it became quite evident that there was you couldn't take pure theories from which maybe the headquarters like to have in Indianapolis or something, and then apply those strategic tools and thinking to these dynamic markets. And so really I spent a long period of my life immersed in trying to be the sandwich between what was the espoused theory and then what needed to be the reality on the ground. And so that became a body of thought that I had, led to the consulting business growth, seemed to work well. And so when I had an opportunity at Singapore Management University to sort of put it into an academic under an academic microscope rather than a practitioner microscope, that's what I did. And I had loads and loads of stories and contacts and people to draw on. And basically what I wanted to look at was, what is strategy, what is management and leadership in highly dynamic contexts. And then in 2015, the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, came up with this title called The Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is all about dynamic markets and disruptions and so forth. And so I realized that what I was working on was globally applicable and very timely, rather than only about Asia and how difficult Asia has been. But basically, it was drawing on best part of 30 years of experience of operating in Asia, but trying to retrofit classical strategy tools.
Tell us about the fourth industrial revolution then. What is this fourth industrial revolution, and why is it so profoundly different in its implications for management, leadership, strategy to prior industrial revolutions?
Yeah. Well, so it's the fourth. So there have been three previous ones, right? And it's an industrial revolution, which means there's a lot of change happening. And so the focus of an industrial revolution in the title is about industry, how industries operate. But in reality, an industrial revolution has seismic level impact for society, as well as how businesses operate and so forth. So the first industrial revolution was people leaving agriculture lives and starting to be in small little factories and so forth. We had the steam power coming in and so forth. So you had a mass migration off the land into buildings, and had to have new ways of thinking about managing and organizing those individuals and social issues that came with that. And so we've had a couple of then we had the second industrial revolution, which was around mass production, effectively the dominance of the steel industry and so forth. And we sort of have the great families that became very rich at that period of time, and Ford being a classic family that everyone remembers from that particular industrial revolution. And then the third was around microprocessors, so the computers coming in, the digital age and so forth. So now we're at the fourth. And what is the fourth? So the fourth is equally dramatic in terms of its impact for how societies going to be restructured, and that's a good thing. And that's really what the World Economic Forum was pointing out, that there are a lot of non-sustainable aspects of the society that we've created that we now have an opportunity with the fourth industrial revolution to address. So things like the wealth gap, for example, or obviously sustainability in the environment and so forth. So that's the opportunity, is to create a better society. How do we do that? Well, we're embracing all the technologies that come through. And the technologies that are coming through are now very broad spread. So nanotech, obviously machine learning, AI, and so forth, genomics, so we're getting in many different spheres now the use of these new technologies. As they're adopted at pace by forerunners, and those forerunning companies end up with a disproportionate amount of capital accumulation, and they can then also impact and do things differently. So classic example is Tesla, makes a tenth the number of cars of General Motors. It's worth 10 times the value of General Motors. Tesla's an example of a company which has fully embraced fourth industrial revolution trends. It's got, at least it claims to have a big focus on the environment, sustainability, and so forth. And as a result of that, it's accumulating great wealth. It's in a sector called automotive, in which there are plenty of other legacy players simultaneously. So what is the fourth industrial revolution? It's the embracing of all these technologies coming through in a forward-looking lens, in a way that's going to impact, or does impact, society very significantly. And in that journey, there is massive disruption for incumbent players.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful summary. What does it take to win then, right? The subtitle of your book is, capabilities to achieve superior performance. What then, in your view, does it take to achieve superior performance in broad terms in that kind of environment?
Yeah. So I think that obviously there's lots of different things that we could jump onto, but fundamentally one of the key aspects is purpose. So you can look at many of the, like there are plenty of fourth industrial revolution companies which maybe don't have much purpose. They're accumulating technology, but in order for them to, for companies to succeed and have significant scale and accumulate lots of capital behind them in order for the investment companies to achieve what they want to achieve, there has to be a strong sense of purpose and identity. And that is super, super important, because if you're operating at the frontier of an evolution of an industry or a sector, or the creation of a new space, then what's going to navigate you into that future? Well, it's this idea that you've got a mission, you're trying to accomplish a sense of purpose. And so that enables you then to say, well, this has never been done before. We can't benchmark our way into best performance because it's never been done before. What can we do? Lean forward. As we lean forward, we're going to be taking a bunch of risks and challenges that have never been managed or seen before or addressed before. We're going to have to learn new things about it. And so that keeps us motivated as we lean forward. So I anchor it, therefore, on the sense of purpose. As I said, there are plenty of companies who are operating in 4R who don't have a strong sense of purpose. I would argue that they're not going to accumulate significant wealth and have sustained success. However, there are plenty of an example, apart from obviously the Teslas as well. There's this concept called unicorns. The unicorns out there, which were so called because they were companies worth $1 billion of valuation and yet had never turned a profit. And they're supposed to be super, super rare. And that's why, they're a mythical creature called the unicorn, right? And, but in the last 15 years, we now know that there are over 735 at last count unicorns, right? And they've got a cumulative wealth of capital of about just under $3 trillion that they've got, and that doesn't even include firms like Tesla any longer, which have they are turning a profit now, so they've sort of stopped being unicorns. And so these companies which are setting up or taking advantage of the technologies to create a new space or a new model, they're leaning into that future, and they're doing it usually in the pursuit of something that's purpose-based.
You talk a lot in the book about dynamic capacity, right?
Yeah.
So purpose, if you like, is the anchor for that herd of unicorns. But then a lot of the how, if you like, is lies in this idea of dynamic capacity. Can you say a little bit about what dynamic capacity or capacities are, and why you see them as being so important?
Yeah. So if you're leaning heavily into the future, which is unfolding, and you don't know what the future is, your lens by which you're going to have to take decisions is always going to be relatively murky, right? And this is a fundamental difference to traditional views of strategy, which is about analysis and then structure and then taking informed decisions, right? So, and this is directly, so the concept of dynamic capacity is directly from that time in Asia when I was working with these companies there. You have three sets of skills which need to come together to give you flexibility and adaptability. Trying to avoid the word agility because agility is a little bit overused, but flexibility and adaptability. And the first of those skills is you need to have really good sensory capabilities. You need to be able to sense things that are coming down the pipeline, wherever they happen to be, where the weak signals are, and you need to be able to make sense of them for yourself. Right? So that's capability of sensing and making sense. And then the second capability you need on the back of that, once you've made sense of what's going to happen, hasn't yet happened, or could happen, is you need to decide what you're going to do about it, right? So I call that the capability to seize opportunities, or to quickly change direction, to avoid something that might be more threatening, or replicate and scale up very quickly. So it's the seize and replicate idea that comes on the back of sense and make sense. And then the third capability that comes with that is the willingness and desire and ability to reconfigure your assets or reposition your offering at pace, and not after, again, not in a step change, staccato kind of way, only when crisis is happening, but in a manner which is more like morphing from one stage to another, testing the boundaries, porous boundaries of the organization. So dynamic capacity is the combination of these three sets of capabilities. There are lots of specific capabilities within each of those. And interestingly, when I was doing the research, is that if you measure your capability to sense and make sense, you measure the capability to seize and replicate, capability to reposition and reconfigure at pace. If you multiply those three things together, that gives you an index or a measure of dynamic capacity. The higher that the company is on that index, the better it performs in fast-moving, unstable environments, and that leads to superior performance and outperformance of other companies. So I ended up came up with this index for all these companies that were involved in the work, in the research with me, creating up this index, and then tracked the share price performance of those companies against their own competitors. So Tesla was not part of it, but if you want to build on that story, it will be how did Tesla do against General Motors? For example, they weren't part of the sample set, but and what I found was that those firms that had higher than the average dynamic capacity as the index outperformed the share price of their own competitors by over 30% over a 5-year period of time. And those firms which were below average on the dynamic capacity index underperformed their sector peers by about 15%. So that's a 47% swing, basically, of the share price performance of firms due to where they are on their dynamic capacity index against their own sector peers. So that's in a nutshell what is dynamic capacity.
There's a lot. I mean, some people, when they pick the book up, they might be surprised. Given what you said at the start around the importance of technology in the fourth industrial revolution, that actually a lot of what you emphasize is quite human in a sense, right? There's a set of stories in the book around the war for talent and how important it is to keep and hold and build and develop talent. There's a lot, in a sense, it's quite a human scale book in the context of quite a meta, as you say, kind of seismic societal shift, an economic shift. Where does the emphasis on people come from, if you like, in a world where people might have expected an emphasis on technology?
Yeah. So one of the interesting factors of the fourth industrial revolution is that technology itself is not a differentiator. If you like, it becomes so ubiquitously available that, yes, there are people or firms at the frontier of creating that technology, they'll be fine. But most firms in economy are not going to be the technology creators. They're going to be the accessing the technology, which others great. Cloud is a great way. You don't have to own it any longer. You rent it, for example, right? And so what makes the difference is talent, whether or not you can harness that technology with people who actually know what to do with it, new business models, whatever they happen to be, and so forth. So they're not necessarily the technologists. They are talent that can work with the technology in order to get sustainable, superior performance. There's a big crisis of productivity in the UK. The UK's productivity level is, I think, currently like 30% lower than France's productivity level. And there has been a debate, which I was asked to be involved with, of what technology can be adopted to help move us up the productivity, try and recover some of this lost ground. And I would say that technology is important. Like, you don't want to be using obsolete technology and behind the curve on that, but really it's about how you harness that, what you do with it. And that's all about people. And so to put that into perspective, there are the World Economic Forum's report from 2025, not very far away, 84 million jobs were going to be lost due to the fourth industrial revolution in OECD countries, in developed countries. But in the same period of time, 95 million new jobs were going to be created, which require 4IR skills, fourth industrial revolution skills. So that means obviously as a net gain, but that's a huge, human resource retooling exercise that's got to go on there. And that goes down to, so the leadership has to have the vision about where we're going. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck where we are, and we're not going to be leaning forward. So that's leadership, and how we manage the human resource talent pool that we've got is absolutely critical. So the capabilities of sense make sense, seize, replicate, and so forth. Super important. They're not technologies per se; they can be enabled by technologies, but it's management and leadership.
Yeah, that certainly resonates for me. The other concept that intrigued me as I read the book was this notion of reverse polarity, right? Where knowledge from the periphery of an organization moves towards the center. Can you talk us through the idea of reverse polarity and its significance?
Sure. So the classic old model of a corporation may have been that you had a corporate center, corporate hub somewhere, maybe even an R&D center somewhere, and then ideas were percolated, their new strategies were percolated, insights, and then disseminated out to the periphery or so around the network. And what we've figured out is that can lead to ossification. It certainly leads to groupthink within the centers. There's a competition for budgets, for projects, which ones get approved and so forth, and how they get through. And then there's a process which may or may not work of adaptation of whatever's being developed in the center, policy, product, whatever, to the markets externally. Well, in 4IR, we need to be having heightened sensory capability. Sensor makes sense. So if you're a corporation which has got operations in 30, 50 countries, of which a bunch of them don't look like your home market, what you want to be doing is turning up your listening capabilities to what's happening in those markets, because they're all different centers with unique characters, but they're all experimental petri dishes of things. And if you can be listening to what's happening in those markets and then collect that together to make sense of it coherently, which may be in the center or may not be in the center, may be a virtual way of doing that. You collaborate together virtually. Then you've heightened your sensory capability. So rather than downplaying it because everything's done from the center and then broadcast out, you actually up your sensory capability by listening to the periphery. So reverse polarity is essentially that. The ideas and insights should come from the most dynamic markets, and they should flow towards some sense-making capability, wherever that is, may in the center or not. And so one of the factors that came out from the research was that the companies that are really good at this, one of the things that they don't have a singular headquarters with all their staff in it, or a singular R&D center. What they have is they have networks of dislocated experts. So they are, in tune with each other, but they're not having that group thinking, group bias. What they're having is an ability to see and sense everything, and then they share that across. So that's reverse polarity.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating idea. I really do. I'll ask a question I feel I ask of every book in this series, and actually there's a gateway to it because Arnaud de Meyer does a really good foreword for your book. He makes the point in that foreword. He sort of situates it a bit in COVID, and he sort of says, look, COVID is accelerating lots of these 4IR trends. Clearly you were writing the book before COVID, but I'm intrigued to ask, what implications has the pandemic had, or what could it have for the kinds of trends and the salience of the sorts of capabilities that you put at the forefront of management and leadership? Yeah.
So COVID has, the response to COVID rather, has informed companies that they need to be agile or flexible and adaptable, right? So waiting for your annual planning cycle to come around before you adjust plans has been proven ineffective. And so that learning, I think, is critical to building up the dynamic capacity of a firm, right? And hopefully organizations don't regress back to that model, post-pandemic. So I would say that's definitely number one. I think number two is there's a very, there has been for a lot of organizations a much heightened awareness of investing in the well-being of individuals. So recognizing the perhaps amount of stress, anxiety is going on, the disruption of work, how people work, and so forth, and we need to have a greater, as employers, we need a great degree of empathy for workers and helping them through that. And with the disruptions of 4AR, I mentioned about the 84 million versus 95 new jobs and so forth. That's a massive dislocation that's going to go on. That's not dependent on the pandemic. But we want to have employers, organizations, which are sensitive to the stresses and strains of the workforce, helping them reskill, upskill, reskill for AR. Maybe they stay with the same firm, but they are upskilled in advance of their job being made obsolete. And then in theory, this company looking to hire externals. So what we want is this heightened awareness of investing in employees, recognizing employees are different and they're under lots of stress and anxiety. I think that's a thing that we've seen in the pandemic. We want that to continue to help employees, workers deal with the dislocation and the pressures of 4AR.
Yeah, certainly we've seen a lot of that. It's tempting to say, well, I'll ask it as a question. So what's the status of strategy in this new world? I mean, a lot of what you say, in a sense, it leads you to, if you go down that garden path, you sort of say, well, let's chuck away all traditional strategy at one level. What's the, I guess what's the reaction to that? What is the status of strategy in this new world?
Yeah. Strategy is dead, long live strategy. I think the way I see it is there's various schools of strategy which have not perhaps been the dominant schools historically, which are coming more into it. So there's a whole area of what is one of the legacy old schools of strategy was the resource-based view of the firm, right? Where the resources were mainly, what assets you had and the people and so forth, and how you could configure those to give you sustainable competitive advantage. And then from that school of thought became this idea of dynamic capabilities, which is things like described dynamic capacity before, but to what extent can you build up those capabilities of individuals or in the organization as a resource which will help you compete and have sustainable competitive. And so from that school of thought, you get into this, you already have acknowledgement of a world which is changing quite rapidly, or is changing, maybe not as rapidly as was expected. Now we're seeing that on steroids, that the world is changing much more quickly. But if you can build up those core capabilities, sense it makes sense, sensory capabilities, seize and replicate, and so forth, then it is a formula for success in this fast-changing world. And the origins, if you like, the source for that is the resource-based view of the firm, right? And then I think the other word that we need to revisit and reclassify is this idea of sustainable competitive advantage. And so a lot of the strategy theory was around how do we have sustainable competitive advantage. Well, I think we need to revisit the word sustainable. So we have competitive advantage, and Rita Gunther-McGrath said this quite well. She said it's the end of sustainable competitive advantage. It now will move to a world of transient competitive advantage. So basically, in a world which is changing very rapidly, how can we still have good strategy, recognizing it's going to be transient in nature and we don't hold on to it for too long? So the analogy, one of the analogies I like to use for this one is, again, it's from an old Chinese proverb, but it's about crossing the river, a fast moving river, on stepping stones, which are below the water surface. So you can do that fine, but you're not going to do that by moving to one stepping stone and standing there with your 2 feet whilst the water current is smashing against your legs and probably, moving you away. You can get across the river by jumping from one to the next, keeping that momentum going. And so you'll get there. but you're going from transient position to transient position. And what's the skill you've got? The skill to see when the next rock is, the ability to get there in a timely fashion before you get knocked off where you currently are, and so forth. So you build up those skills, and that will lead you to essentially sustainable success, superior performance through multiple steps of transient competitive advantage.
I mean, as a business and society guy, one of the things that I hadn't expected before I read the book was the emphasis on purpose, which, as you know, is becoming a much more widely discussed phenomenon in the context of business and society work, for example. Can you say a bit more about the centrality of purpose in your analysis, and say a bit more about just why it is that purpose is so important in this new world?
Yeah. So if you're not trying to achieve something big and audacious in this environment, then the temptation is to stay still and optimize where you are effectively, right? And I know there's, we can be pursuing different things, but so the stronger the pull of purpose, the more we're going to lean into the unknown unfolding future. And as we do that, we will have greater reason to improve our sensory capabilities and so forth, right? Those capabilities of dynamic capacity that I talked about. So the stronger the pull is, the more we're going to hone the capabilities required to thrive in this dynamic environment. The weaker that pull is, the more likely is we're going to try and optimize where we're at. And therefore, to use the stepping stones across the fast moving river part, you're more likely to stand still on one and possibly get knocked off by the current. You'll miss the opportunity to go across. So that's where the purpose part comes in. And I think that's it's different than traditional, or a lot of the literature that has about purpose. A lot of the literature about purpose focuses on the ability to attract and retain outstanding talent. And I think that's great and undeniable. But I'm saying, in addition to that, in order to thrive in this fast changing environment, you need to be willing to take risks that if you look purely from a financial analytic kind of view, you might not be willing to do. So strangely, the stronger you are on purpose, that gives you a longer term view and a big anchor, actually makes companies more adaptable and flexible in the shorter term, which is counterintuitive. So some people think that if you don't have that long-term view, you should be more adaptable in the short term. The answer is you're not. Firms don't turn out that way. And so we want that adaptability and flexibility because we're leaning forward into something. So the stronger our lean forward, the more we'll create that adaptability, as well as the benefits of attracting great talent.
I mean, it seems to me that if you can't have a strategy in the classical sense, of positioning in a given market space and so on and so forth, really, in this world. And purpose is almost a substitute for that central kind of compass for the organization in a way, I think. And I think it's a really compelling idea. Steve, I want, predictably, again, in one sense, given my role and function and our role and function now, I'm intrigued to hear you say a bit about the application of your ideas to the HE context. What does this mean for the contemporary university? What might it mean for a contemporary university, and what are the opportunities for universities that think about their positioning and strategy and purpose through the lens of the tools in your book?
Yeah. So clearly there is a huge growth and demand for in-career learning. Hence, I'm very happy to have that role. So, with all this reskilling that's required, you can't take people out of the workplace at that volume, retool them, and then put them back in. So for universities to think about how to support executives or people in careers in work to retool at pace in the flow of work, is a huge opportunity, huge market. Any business school should be jumping on that approach. I think for the broader student body, undergrads, postgrads, student body, I think it's beholden upon universities to ensure that we're covering contemporary issues, not just the basic foundations. People need those, of course, and then we need to apply a lens, or have the students apply a lens which is future looking, current and future looking. Because we don't do that part, what's going to happen is obsolescence. We'll be making 4 years or 3 years of study as a student, but effectively they won't know how to deal with the contemporary issues they'll face in the workplace. So to make them more quote unquote employable, what we really want is a heavy focus on contemporary issues application. And I would argue the best way of doing that is through literal application. So experiences with companies as much as possible. So I see that being as near to the cutting edge of the entities. Even if you take the model of writing case studies, by the time it's happened and you've written a case study about it and it's been published and everybody's signed off on it and so forth, that's probably almost obsolete anyway. So you want to move students as close as you can to the cutting edge of really the issues that are being faced by the companies.
Yeah, I think, as you say, there are some sort of troubling notions for our knowledge production architectures in your analysis, aren't there? I might begin to work through some of the questions. Thanks to folks who are posing those questions. Kino asks an interesting question. I think the thrust of the question is about, what role universities might play as a partner in industry university research incubation. How can those kinds of partnerships and collaborators, workers, he says, now the questions have started to roll in and my screen scrolled, deal makers promote an innovative and supportive environment to facilitate those local businesses. So I guess the question there is about the role of universities and collaborations and incubation in building businesses that are fourth industrial revolution fit, if you like.
Yeah. So I think on the one side, there are going to be some firms which will need support understanding what the technologies are out there. I know we've spent most of the time not talking about technologies, but I think that it can be hard for smaller enterprises perhaps to even know what's available in terms of technologies that could really help them. So I think there can be a role for a university in terms of helping them understand the tools that can be adopted, technology can be adopted. I think beyond that, when we get to the human assets and leadership part, I would say there are a number of things. Obviously, one, learning in the flow of work for executives, which we just talked about. That's upskilling. I think working with folks. There's a free online survey that people can use about this book. You can do it. Any organization can just do an audit themselves of what their level of dynamic capacity is for free, and then also what areas are perhaps needing a tune-up or not, so they can access that kind of thing easily, and then they can self-medicate in fixing it or addressing it, or they can again engage with the university, and then we can help them on that journey as well. So I would say there's probably a bifurcation in terms of, is it just you don't have visibility on the technology side, and then it's in the talent side there is specific learning in the flow of work support, and I think there is also support of this company is struggling to make the transition. How does it transition over? So I would say those parts. These projects that I mentioned before, which are very good for the student side, I would argue as well that there is benefits for companies in hosting a bunch of students who are educated in this stuff to apply that in the so there could be a project-based relationship which is mutually beneficial for the students' learning as well as for the knowledge they bring to the company.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I would certainly value us doing more of that in and around our programs. Fantastic questions coming in. Thanks to folks. Michael Baker asks, I think, a really good question. Do you think HR is up to the job of delivering the requirements for success in the fourth industrial revolution?
Well, yeah. It depends on which HR, I would say. I think there are three big things which HR really needs to crack the code of in order to be successful in this. Number one is, of course, upskilling and reskilling at pace, at scale, right, for the right topics. So how to do that is not the traditional way of, career stage, courses and so forth. Right? So learning in the flow of work, there's that upskilling and reskilling. So that's number one. Number two is for the talent that you've got, you need to make sure it's deployed in the right place and is effective. So that's moving to a model of really fluid teaming. So we talk about an organization thinking about itself as a team of teams, not the second industrial revolution silos organization mentality. And so how do we move to a fluid teaming model in order the talent that we've got is best deployed? And that requires changing performance metrics and feedback mechanisms and so forth. And then the third big area that HR really needs to crack and needs to work is employee well-being, basically, and trying to address this epidemic of stress, which the World Health Organization has said actually going to be the biggest killer, bigger than the current pandemic in this century. And or a side note, is currently estimated to be costing $1 trillion a year in Europe and the US combined of absenteeism and sickness and so forth. So how do we get a human-centered workforce management approach, which is tolerant of the individuals that are engaged in the company, rather than having, here's the job description, little box we want everybody to comply to and fix in, but actually no, now we've got maybe 4 or 5 generations in the workforce. Again, they've got different stresses and strains and health concerns and life stages and economic positions and so forth. How do we have a much more human-centered approach to workforce management rather than a traditional, here's the job description, off you go. So I think those are the 3 big buckets of areas that HR has really got to come to the party with. And I would say some organizations have got it and a lot don't yet.
Yeah, there's certainly a very critical role of HR in all of this, isn't there? So it almost becomes a kind of a really key strategic domain in a range of ways.
Absolutely, yeah.
Temilalua asks a question about the place of renewable energy in the fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah, so it's one of the so 4IR has lots of, well, the United Nations has adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So sustainability of the planet, under which or the environment, sorry, under which renewable energies fit as one of the SDGs. And so the 4IR is looking at embracing technologies that are enabling different business models to come through. So I would say there's a requirement that for 4IR companies, if not every company eventually, the 4IR companies engage in that debate about energy consumption or creation and consumption. I think there's also some companies will actually be on the cusp of actually generating or coming up with a new technologies that will help with renewables. So there's going to be some opportunities there, I would argue. But the vast majority of companies won't be those generating from renewables and so forth. They'll be consuming. So we want those companies to also be embracing that SDG.
Gavin asks a really good question, I think, about the implications for corporate governance of this perspective.
Yeah. So one of the things that was interesting from the index that I mentioned before about the share price difference, if you're as a investor or a board member, you should be holding the management team their toes to the fire and say, what is the level of dynamic capacity you've got? Because we know that the level of dynamic capacity correlates with the ability to outperform competitors at the share price. So I would argue a clear addition to the language of governance needs to be to inquire and insist that there is demonstrated investment to maintain, if not heighten, the level of dynamic capacity of an organization. So I'd say that's a new dimension that comes in for governance.
Yeah, absolutely. Moni asks a really good question too. What's your view of how the role of non-market strategies is evolving in these turbulent markets? So we've talked a lot about, if you like, market-based strategies. What about non-market strategy?
Well, I would say that even government or whatever should be embracing the technologies and the leadership styles which are relevant for 4IR, right? So I would argue that legacy systems are more likely to become dinosaurs. And I think if I look around, since moving back to the UK, I would say there are some very difficult choices that lie ahead for some very well-known established enterprise. I mean, I think the whole healthcare system in the UK is locked in quite a legacy model of thinking and management. And that is one that, because it's locked, it's very hard, and people are very emotional about it. So it's very hard to move forward with that. In market-based organizations, there's oftentimes a market that impetus to succeed, or that measure can help take tougher decisions or change course. Things are working out, they're not. In situations where there isn't such an obvious market and there's lots of regulation, it can take a crisis before there's movement forward, which I think is a real crying shame. But yeah, you need to have that pressure and desire from somewhere to move forward. And yeah, I would argue that there are a number of institutions or situations in the UK, but everywhere where that's it's not even. I worked with the Singapore government on the remanagement of the healthcare system a few years ago, and that was because there was the three goals which were seen to be incompatible. One being universal access, one being keeping it affordable for the Treasury, right? And another one being very high quality healthcare available. And so how can you go after all three goals? And the only way to go forward, and so that was sponsored by both the Treasury and by the healthcare sector. But the way forward that was found didn't sacrifice any of those goals. But it involved a broad cross-section of people coming together to solve this seemingly impossible triple header. And so I think that you need to have a benevolent, informed, and courageous governance system if you're going to take on transformation of some of these big problems, because there's not a market force to generate that momentum to tackle difficult issues.
Mike Willis again asks a really good question, I think, which is where I imagine your consulting experience will come in handy. The question is, how adaptive is senior management, especially in large, well-established organizations, to embracing this new trend and the skills they need to develop to succeed? I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah. So there's a really interesting piece of research that was done in by Harvard, about for 3 years ago, 3 years ago, when it was to monitor to check the attitudes of different levels of managers for leaning in to this dislocation of jobs and so forth. And the most willing were the lower levels of staff, mid-level managers and down. And the least willing were the more senior. And which wasn't what they were expecting. But the answer is, I mean, it's kind of obvious when you think about it. It's like, who's going to lose out more from job dislocation, right? It's the people lower down. So, they're going to be essentially dislocated out if they don't have the right skills. And so they are actually keenest to be learning new skills as quickly as possible so they stay relevant. whereas oftentimes the senior management may not believe that they are not going to become they're going to become obsolete or less relevant. So I think that is so your question's spot on, I think, to that issue, and it goes back in some ways to what's the either governance or market force or other force that is going to require organizations or leadership to lean forward into the unfolding unknown future. And so if there aren't those pressures, if those pressures are not felt very strongly by the leadership, then it's unlikely they'll change. So it can become from governance, like we talked about, shareholder activism, investors, whatever it happens to be, can be ambition of the individuals, that they just simply say we've got to embrace some purpose because we don't have a reason to get out of bed any longer, or it can be market force. But there needs to be some way of leaning forward. Yeah, there's less perhaps motivation otherwise for senior leaders to embrace it.
Sarah Thomas, how do these principles translate to smaller or mid-size and less complex organizations, perhaps those without a formal R&D function or HR teams and so on? So we talked a bit about corporates and a bit about public sector. What about SMEs and startups?
Yeah. So one of the things that was really quite interesting was that this idea of a founder's mindset. It was coined a few years ago, and founder's mindset. So as an SME is a classic example of that. There's a founder, and so they are often highly attuned to what's unfolding around them. So that sensory capabilities can be quite high because that's their survival, right? Their and so that was in a sort of an assumption that I had going into the work. What happened after the big piece of work with big corporations and when I looked at SMEs, and what happened with that, we found the sensory capability wasn't really that good, and the reason is because they don't have a broad enough network, so they're not picking up all the weaker signals that are happening somewhere else. They've got high motivation to be adaptable and agile and so forth, but actually their ability to see beyond the horizon is quite limited. And so one of the clear takeaways from that is every organization, whatever size, needs to work on this dynamic capability. And that's going to have to require to improve the sensing and making sense capability, as well as seize and replicate and so forth. And what a founder for organization needs to do is make sure that it's connecting with sources of insight outside of its own borders, because it's too small as an entity. So how does it do that? It can be through different organizations and membership of things. And of course, we've got so many different social media platforms and clubs and environments to be in, but be plugged into those in a way that is actually helping to broaden the sensory capabilities. So that's something. The ability to seize and replicate, again, we like to think it's faster in an SME type of small environment. What we find is that it's very dependent upon the individual who's the founder or the leader of the organization. It can be, this is what's got us here, this is what we know has made us successful, and real desire just to dig in and hold on to it. We don't really understand what's going on in the big wide world outside us, and this has worked in the past, so we'll hold on to that and we'll change later. So some of these things that we assumed, or I assumed going into the SME piece of work, that the smaller founder-led firms would be great at, actually it turns out that they're not ubiquitously. So I would say that smaller SME, you've got to get to the leader, and they've got to make sure that they are heightening their awareness of how to sense, make sense, seize and replicate, scale quickly, and reconfigure and reposition. So again, if you buy the book, there's lots of tools and ideas of actions that can be adopted at any firm of whatever size in order to heighten those capabilities.
Indeed, buy the book. It's a very good book. Perhaps time for one last question. So Shireen asks a question about what the key requirements are to build and successfully utilize dynamic capacities for adaptability and flexibility. So it's kind of what's the layer behind? What do you have to do to build and then use those dynamic capacities that you talk about in the book?
Yeah. So you need to, this is where I sort of close the loop and go back to where we started. You've got to have a reason for wanting to do this. Right? And a broad cross section of the leadership team has got to buy into that reason. And so my anchor, and that's why I started the first question this way, was that anchor on the future purpose. If you want to have an impact on society, or even just your community or your family, whatever it happens to be, that's meaningful, going to be moving the needle forward. That's the anchor into the future, and then you have a reason to lean forward, and you're going to have a reason to build these capabilities. If you don't have that reason, then you can languish and repeat what we're doing as we're doing it. So that's what I'd call that.
Absolutely fantastic. I think that feels like a wonderful place to leave it. So thank you, Steve, for a really fantastic expose of your amazing book. Folks will see it on the shelf behind you. Management and Leadership in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I think it's a really, really thoughtful book about contemporary strategy, or in a sense, contemporary non-strategy in sense. I think it's a really interesting book. Thanks to everyone who has attended. Thanks to everybody who has posed questions. Very grateful for those, and hope you had some real benefit from engaging. Look forward to seeing many of you in the new year for further Dean's Book Series events. So thank you very much for attending. Have a wonderful rest of day, and I wish you all the best for the festive season. So thanks. Good afternoon.